And just for the fun of it, I'm going to start recording.
Good.
Okay,
Okay.
looks like it's working.
Is it working? All
We'll
right.
see.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here this evening for Rabbi Michael Lotker. I'm going to give you a little bio on him, even though he's been here many times and you already know a lot about him. So he's a second career rabbi. He was ordained at the age of 55 from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. In 2003, he and I were classmates and good friends. He's a physicist who spent his first career in alternative energy, focusing on wind, solar, and geothermal energy. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics from Queens College in New York City and from the University of Illinois. Prior to his ordination, he received his Master of Hebrew Letters degree from Hebrew Union College. An entrepreneur, he started a number of alternative energy firms, including a wind power development company that installed and operated wind farms in Hawaii and California. He's widely published in the alternative energy field. Right now, he is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Ner Ami in Camarillo, California, and the scholar in residence at Temple Adat Elohim in Thousand Oaks. And he's the community rabbi for the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. He's a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Board of Rabbis of Southern California. His interest and participation in interfaith dialogue stimulated his rabbinic thesis entitled Ezer Kenegdo, Toward a Theology of Jewish-Christian Partnership. And he's published, actually, a book on what every serious Christian should know about Judaism, among other things. So he's widely sought after speaker at synagogues, churches, and campuses. And in June of 2014, he offered the opening prayer at the United States House of Representatives. And as you probably know, he's taught a lot of sessions for us, and he teaches a lot of sessions online. And if you go to Lotker, wait, what is it?
Yeah,
Lotker?
I'll talk about it.
Okay, he'll talk about it. He'll advertise for himself. So he's going to tell you how you can find all his pre-recorded sessions, which are all, wonderful and on a very wide range of subjects. But tonight he's going to talk about science and religion. So Rabbi Michael Lotker.
Okay, thank you. So everyone get out your slide rules. I think you were told to, no, I'm only kidding. This is actually the most obsolete thing, not only that I own, but that I can think of. I am going to go to share screen. And boy, it always gets a little strange when I do this. So are you seeing the PowerPoint screen?
Nope.
Nope.
No, we're seeing
yourselves?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on. Try it one more time. Hope it works.
It's the power.
Is that better?
Yes, there it is.
Great. Okay, thank you. So yeah, I have a PowerPoint presentation. And as Rabbi was saying, I do have a website, lotker.com, just my last name. And if you go to the opening page, you'll see a little selection for classes. And then I have to confess, this is not the best organized website. So if you scroll down, basically you'll see everything I've been teaching for the last 2 years. It's easy to record, as you can tell, and it's also frighteningly easy to post on YouTube. And everything I've done really is there, including a number of classes with this title about science and religion. And specifically, if you're really interested in hearing more detail about this, so here is a 3-session version of the same class. And there's actually a very nice bibliography. And I think also I have a handout on significant quotes about science and religion. So the entire discussion can be summarized as follows. So do you have any questions? In the Bible, it says, V'yomer Hashem, V'yomer Adonai, and now we have Einstein's, equations of relativity, particularly those resulting in conversion of energy and matter, and Yehi Or, and there was light. So I often say, people will ask me, and you will get the answer, how do I reconcile science and religion? And there's a couple of kind of cute answers to that. One is that God speaks 2 languages, Hebrew and calculus, and I've been privileged to study both. Another more serious quote, I don't actually know if I have this on one of my slides, but it's in the significant quotes on science and religion, and in the 3-session class, you'll hear a lot about that. This is from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of Great Britain, who said, "Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean." So I think that's something important to keep in the backs of your mind. So I'd love to start this discussion, and I know you're all muted, but I think we have enough time so you can answer the question. This morning, I came into the kitchen and there was a teapot boiling on the stove. And so my question is, why was the teapot boiling? So would someone like to answer that briefly? Yeah, go ahead, Sandra.
Because your wife turned on the stove before you got up.
Yes, that's true. So
That's
why
great.
was it boiling?
Because the stove was turned on underneath it.
Okay, so you're the first person ever to get the second answer first, I have to say, and I've been giving this talk probably for 15 years. So often what people will start to say is the stove heats the water gets hot, you know, and I can spend 20 minutes putting you to sleep and talk about thermodynamics of boiling water. But so one answer is because the stove heated the water to its boiling point. It's what Aristotle called the efficient cause, how the phenomenon takes place. But there's another answer, which Sandra got right away. It's because my wife wanted tea. So Aristotle called this the final cause, the reason why the phenomenon takes place. So the question is, do we have to decide between one correct and one incorrect answer? If I accept the first answer about the water heating and so on, is that the only answer, or can it also be why that my wife wanted tea? Clearly, both answers are correct. So now the question is, why is there a universe? And one answer is everything we know about science and cosmology. And I have to confess, there's a lot I don't know about science and cosmology, but basically a scientific explanation for the creation of the universe. So I absolutely accept that. And another answer would be because God wanted a universe. And of course, my point is you don't at all have to choose between one and the other. One interesting question, which I love to hear people's speculation on, and if you'd like to share yours, is why did God want a universe? You know, before creation of the physical universe, presumably there was God, if we accept the understandings of God in our tradition. And then God decided to create a physical universe. Anybody want to take a crack at why God would want a physical universe?
I just read a commentary on this. I don't remember who wrote it, but just the idea that God, in order to know God's self, has to be in relation with another.
Oh, nice. Yes. So there's two categories of answers that I often hear on this. One I really don't like. The one I really don't like is if God is to be glorified and praised, we need a chorus to glorify and praise God. That doesn't give me a very appealing a picture of God. The second is what Rabbi was getting at, and I've heard it said, and I've said it in many ways. God is a God of relationships, and certainly Hebrew is a language of relationships, and we can talk more about that. But God, one answer, I think I've heard Larry Kushner say this, God likes stories. Another way of saying this is God wants to be in relationship with us. So that I really like. So now the question is the universe the result of God or simply a scientific random phenomenon? This is actually something that we can take a look at from the perspective of science. And, Rabbi Singer talked a little bit about my training in physics. I am, as some of you know, I describe what happened to me as adult onset Judaism. Namely, although I was born Jewish and raised by two Jewish parents, I had very little interest in Judaism until my 30s. And I, like everyone else, have had tragedy in my life. In fact, I always quote Joseph Telushkin's mother, Helen, of blessed memory, who said what I think is the truest statement I've ever heard, which is, she said, the only people I know that have no serious problems in their lives are people I don't know very well. And as you get to know anyone beyond a trivial level of depth, you realize that there is no life untouched by tragedy. Mine also. This ultimately, I found great support in my Jewish community to help me deal with this tragedy. And that led me to a career in the rabbinate. So here are two key reasons why I became religious and started taking Judaism seriously. So reason number one, and reasonable people can disagree with these, I want to emphasize it, but these for me are compelling. Reason number one, without God, there is no objective morality. What is the source of ethics? Is the source of ethics what's right and wrong, popular opinion, or the opinion of the most powerful guy on your block or in your nation or in the world? Or is there some source of what is right and wrong beyond popular opinion? What Hitler did was didn't violate any laws. It didn't violate the laws of Germany, which he made. Same thing with Stalin and Pol Pot and so on. So does that mean because what they did was legal mean it was okay? If not, and I think most of us would say it's not, then what is the source of ethics ultimately? So that's, for me, compelling reason number one. Without God, there's no objective morality. And compelling reason number two is, without God, there's no intrinsic meaning to life. So here are some sheets of paper. Paper is an organic hydrocarbon. If I burn it, I get some energy, I get some water vapor, and I get some carbon dioxide, and there's some ash left behind. If I take one of my grandchildren and burn them, what I get is some energy, I get some water vapor, and I get some carbon dioxide, and I get some remnants, ash, left behind. From a scientific point of view, from a chemical engineering point of view, there's essentially no difference between burning a child and burning a sheet of paper. This I cannot accept. I refuse to accept the idea that there is no meaning to life, or our meanings are sort of self-generated. I believe that there is meaning to life. Notice, and I point out here, I can't prove either of these points. I simply refuse to live my life according to them. And notice that these don't speak to whether or not there is a God. In a way, it speaks to whether or not there is a necessity for God, rather than whether or not there is a God. So there are problems on both sides, people who accept God and people who reject God. Those who reject God have to explain away all the evidence for God, which I'm going to get into in a moment, and a basis for living an ethical life. And those who accept God must explain the basis for evil and tragedy in the world. And I'm going to attempt to address both of these. So my own way of looking at this is, there are two leaps of faith associated with religion. Leap of faith number one is there a God? And for this leap of faith, what I mean by God is an intelligence behind the creation of the universe. And actually, the word Elohim fits very well. The word Elohim is a word which also means judge. And it's, I think of as sort of the scientific creationist God. And then the second leap of faith is, does God care? I'll be talking about all kinds of laws of physics. So did the God that created all of these laws of physics care whether I have turkey or ham for dinner tonight? Care whether I am kind or torture babies? So those, for me, are two separate leaps of faith. And I'm going to address the first one first. So can we prove that God exists? Some would say yes. Here are two very interesting books which would argue yes. One is called New Proofs for the Existence of God by Robert J. Spitzer, who is a Catholic priest. And he's got two major sections in this book. One deals with the physics, one deals with the philosophy. I followed the physics, I could not follow the philosophy. And then a very interesting book, which is out within the last year, called Return of the God Hypothesis. And the subtitle here is 3 Scientific Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. And that's very, very much what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. By the way, I probably won't monitor the chat. If you have a question, you can post it in the chat. Rabbi Singer, I'll ask you to keep an eye on the chat. But we're a small enough group so that, you know, every now and again, maybe I will pause and ask if there's any questions. But if you're having burning questions, that's the difference between watching this online and a YouTube video and watching live as we are. You can ask questions, and I'm in no hurry this evening. So can we prove God exists? I would say if we could prove God's existence, someone would have done it by now. And what do I mean by proving God's existence? Proving it so that all reasonably intelligent and honest people would agree, yes, there is a God. We have proved that the earth is spherical and not flat. I know there's a flat earth society, but even they don't take themselves seriously. So there's no scientific controversy about whether the earth is a sphere. As time goes on, that may be the only thing that there's no scientific controversy on, but at least at the moment, that's been proven. And there's some interesting proofs of that. Even the ancient Egyptians had interesting proofs of that. But clearly, the world does not agree on whether there is a God. So I would say not that there is proof for God's existence, but there is compelling evidence for an organizing intelligence in the universe. So one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to take a few minutes of your time to watch this video just because it's fantastic. One of my favorite quotes from Einstein, and there's a lot of good quotes from Einstein, is the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Namely, that we humans, having evolved from, you know, slime and fish and so on, can within our brains contemplate what you're about to see. And I presume you'll be able to see it and hear some music. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So you can see every few seconds we're moving away by a factor of 10 in distance. want you to notice how empty the atom is.
Fabulous video.
Thank you, with apologies for the advertising. So this little lump of protoplasm that you have between your ears is able to contemplate the expanse that we just looked at. So on the subject of evidence for God's existence, there's a category of evidence which really talks about how magnificently fine-tuned the universe is. The universe that we find ourselves in is astoundingly fine-tuned. And there are a couple of basic forces that govern the universe. I think there's actually a total of about 20, but the major ones I've listed here. So let's take one that we're all familiar with, the gravitational constant. I'll get up a little pen here. So you know, if I let go of this pen, it will fall. And there is a formula, and it's actually quite a simple formula as physics formulas go, which describes the force between the pen and the earth. And the formula is the force that is attracting the pen to the center of the earth, down toward the center of the earth, is equal to the product of the mass of the earth, which is quite large, times the mass of the pen, which is quite small, divided by the square of the distance between the pen and the center of the earth, times some number, a gravitational constant G. So the formula, the structure of the formula is sort of governed by geometry, but the number G is a really interesting number. If that number were heavier, if that number were greater, there would be a greater attractive force. But that has now consequences with things like stars. If the force of gravity is very, very large, then everything collapses and just stays into a black hole. If the force is lighter, then we all lose a few pounds. But if the force gets much lighter, then there's not enough gravity to form stars in the first place. And stars actually are the engines which create atoms heavier than hydrogen. So as you'll see, I get into one level of more complexity on this. At one end, and it's not even at the end of a spectrum, if you take the fine tuning slightly out of whack, there is no hydrogen in the universe. If there's no hydrogen in the universe, there's no water in the universe. There are no hydrocarbons in the universe. Our life certainly is based on hydrocarbons. If you make the force slightly less, then the entire universe is hydrogen. So you have hydrogen atoms scattered thinly through the universe. Certainly not a very interesting universe. There is something called the electromagnetic force. I think you all may remember from high school chemistry, positives and negatives, opposite charges attract. So we have a nucleus, you just saw it, in the center of an atom. The nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. I'm giving a very simplified model here. And then you have electron or an electron cloud whizzing around the nucleus. The center, the nucleus is hanging on to the electrons by attracting them. And the formula looks exactly the same, except there's another constant, the electromagnetic constant. So again, if that constant were a little weaker, then the electrons would fly off and we'd have random positive charges and random negative charges floating around the universe. The entire universe would be in a state that physicists call a plasma. If you make that force a little bit larger and the nucleus has a tighter hold on those electrons, I don't know if you know this, but atoms are very well behaved. They share. Atoms share their electrons. So you introduce two hydrogen atoms to an oxygen atom, and they get together and share their electrons, and what we wind up with is water. But if the force of attraction were too large, they would not share their electrons at all, and we would have no compounds. We would only have atoms. Again, not a very interesting universe. remember that nucleus, all positive protons and neutrons, positive charges. Positive charges repel each other, but the nucleus somehow manages to stay together. That's called the strong nuclear force. And I'll talk a little bit more about these. And it turns out it's not only the value of these forces, but the ratios of the values, which are important. There's an interesting book by Martin Rees called Just Six Numbers, which talks about the ratio of the constants. So I'll give you some examples here. If you take the electromagnetic force, that's the positives and negatives are bound, attract each other. If you divide that by the gravitational constant, you just take those two numbers, you get roughly a 1 followed by 36 zeros. The ratio is very large. The electromagnetic force is much larger than the gravitational force. If we have a few less zeros, if the gravitational force were stronger, not only would we have the problems that I just mentioned, but you'd have a big bang followed quickly by a big crunch, because the gravitational force would overcome the expansion velocity and the energy in the expansion velocity, and you'd have the universe collapsing again very quickly, depending on what the number is. Not an interesting universe. Another ratio, which is easy to remember, 007, defines how tight that binding is in the nucleus, and it's the result that I mentioned earlier. If you take that from 007, the ratio, to 006, you have a universe that's entirely hydrogen. If you take it up to 008, there's no hydrogen, no water. This is from Meyer. There's subatomic particles called up quarks and down quarks. If you ask detailed questions about this, I won't be able to answer it, but I think there are some people here that might be able to. The masses of the quarks must have simultaneously met 9 different conditions in the early universe. Their masses must have had a value between 0 and 1 trillionth of a Planck mass, a fine tuning in 1 part to 10 to the 27, a 1 followed by 27 zeros. In the same way, the value of G, the gravitational constant, has to be tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 35th power. So if you put all these together and you say, well, there's lots of different values, there's no inherent reason why the gravitational constant had to be what it is, why the electromagnetic constant is, why the ratios are what they are. If you take them all together and say, among the range of possibilities, what's the probability that it's exactly right to find ourselves in what we would call an anthropomorphic universe? What's an anthropomorphic universe? A universe capable of supporting anthros, life as we know it. According to Spitzer, it's 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 132nd power. That is a number that's unimaginably large. If you just wrote that number in 10-point type or 12-point type, the number of zeros in the number would be more than the number of atoms in the universe. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how huge that number is, and therefore 1 in that number is the probability of finding ourselves in an anthropomorphic universe. But a little less mathematical are some other interesting aspects of the universe as we find it. And one has to do with the shape of Earth's orbit. So here we have the familiar solar system. You can tell it's an old slide because Pluto is still in there qualifying as a planet. I don't know what Pluto did to get excommunicated, but anyway, it's still in there. So according to the laws, this is simple Newtonian physics. If you have a body orbiting another body, what you have is the orbit is an ellipse. An ellipse can be perfectly circular, or it can be very, very, very elongated. And it turns out the most circular orbit of any planet in our solar system is the Earth. And if the Earth's orbit were as elongated as the next most circular planet, we would go through seasons of absolutely freezing all the water on the earth as we got farther from the sun, to boiling all the water as we got closer to the sun. So we are not only are we in the right spot, namely, we're not out there with Pluto and we're not in there with Mercury and Venus, but even the shape of our orbit seems to be fine-tuned to allow life. One of my favorites is the structure of the water molecule. As you all know, and illustrated here, if you put ice cubes in a glass of water, the ice cubes float. Why do the ice cubes float? Because when water freezes, it expands, which is very unusual. Most things, when they go from a liquid state to a solid state, they contract as they get colder and colder. So what does that mean? Ice floating means in places like Minneapolis, people are skating on ice ponds, right? As the temperature gets cold in temperate areas of the earth, water freezes over, and the freezing on the top, rather than freezing from the bottom up, the freezing on top protects the temperature and thereby the life and evolution of other things living down below. And that's not the end of the interesting aspects of the water molecule. So this is the only slide, computational slide I'm going to show you. It turns out, again, water, like most objects, as you make it cooler and cooler, it contracts. And as it contracts, it sinks. So what we're saying here is, as you go down in temperature, the density of water increases. So if you've ever noticed, diving into a lake, when you dive down deeper, the water is cooler down there because the cold water contracts, gets heavier, and sinks. Even sometimes I notice this in my car. If I get in my car and I take a bottle of water, the hot water is on the top and the colder water is on the bottom. But notice in this chart there is a maximum, and it occurs at 4 degrees centigrade. So what that means is, or about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So what that means is, in this lake, as the water gets colder and colder and colder, it sinks, and the heaviest water is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, protecting the life of the muck and the murk where human life is evolving at the bottom of this pond. And I've never heard a chemist explain to me what it is about the structure of the water molecule that leads to those things. So there's lots of evidence for God's existence. There's a wonderful book by a friend of mine, lives not very far, named Robert Piccioni, and he's got some interesting books, and he calls this the Goldilocks zone. So one of the things he talks about is our galaxy, the Milky Way. The Milky Way is actually in a pretty good place in the universe. It's not so close to the center of the universe. If it were much closer to the center of the universe, we would be bombarded with far more radiation than we are now, because in the center of the universe, you're having these collapsing stars and black holes and things going on at a much higher rate. We are even in a good neighborhood in the galaxy. We are in the suburbs of the galaxy. I don't know if you know this, and it doesn't affect real estate prices, but we're in the burbs. And again, far away from the center of the galaxy where there would be far more radiation. I talked about the solar system and the structure of the solar system, but even the sun, the mass of the sun, the constancy of the sun barely fluctuates in output. The fact that it's a single star, most stars in the universe are double stars or even more than 2 stars closely rotating each other. If we were a planet circulating a double star, the path of our orbit would be far more erratic, and the stability of seasons would just go out the window. We have nice planetary neighbors. Jupiter is a wonderful planetary neighbor. The gravitational effect on Jupiter has, for the most part, kept asteroids from colliding with the Earth. But one did get past Jupiter, and we call that, the result of that, the moon. So there was a large body which collided with the Earth, liquefied much of the Earth, created electrical currents in the center of the Earth, which is responsible for the fact that we have a magnetic field, We have magnetic north and south poles. And we'll see in a moment that that magnetic field is important. And also the moon is by far the largest satellite of any planet in terms of the mass of the satellite, the moon, related to the mass of the planet, the Earth. Compare this with moons of, of Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and so on. And what that means is the rotational stability of the Earth. The Earth doesn't wobble on its orbit so much, again, stabilizing seasons. All of this seems to be precisely chosen to allow life on Earth. Here, I need to get rid of that. So this is actually some of what I've already covered, that the Milky Way is a good galaxy. I always forget I have this slide. The nature of our star, the fact that Jupiter protects us, moon gives us a magnetic field that is much larger than other planets. You'll see the impact of that magnetic field in a moment. And then we're in the right position in relation to other planets in the solar system. 1/100,000th of the, of the area or the volume of the solar system. We're just in the right place where water can stay liquid throughout the orbit of around the sun. And I talked about the circular nature of Earth's orbit. So Rabbi Singer and I both have odd ways of spending our vacations. One of the ways I spent a vacation was in Manitoba, in Churchill, where the temperature was about 40 degrees below zero. And at about 40 degrees below zero, it doesn't matter whether it's Celsius or Fahrenheit. It's cold, but it's a wonderful place to view the Northern Lights. I think that's me. The reason we see Northern Lights at the North and South Pole is there's radiation coming out of the sun, charged particles coming out of the sun all the time. It turns out this magnetic field, which is a result of the collision that gave us the moon, protects the Earth from this radiation because they're charged particles. They are guided by the magnetic field to the North and South Pole, where they start penetrating the atmosphere. And what you're seeing here is sort of the same thing you see in a fluorescent light bulb, namely the interaction of these charged particles with oxygen and nitrogen atoms, and they're a physical evidence of this blanket. If there were no magnetic field, the impact of all of this solar wind, these charged particles, would be to strip the atmosphere. There would be no atmosphere on Earth. That's what happened to Mars. Mars had an atmosphere at one time. We're learning more about it, but ultimately, because it didn't have a protective magnetic field, no atmosphere, no life. Moving on to creation of life itself. One of the realities that we know is the essence of life is DNA. That's, the thing, DNA, RNA, all living things have, which defines the fact that they're living. And DNA develops almost immediately after the Earth cools to a point where DNA can be stable. So the question is, was that an accident? Was this just the primordial soup of the Earth, and maybe the right lightning bolt hit the right atom and out popped some DNA which could then reproduce itself? Or was there something guiding it? And the answer to this is influenced by the fact that although it's been 60 or more years since the discovery of the structure of DNA, scientists have been unable to reproduce a DNA strand in the laboratory. So my friend Bob Piccioni wrote a book covering these topics called "Can Life Be Merely an Accident?" So the question is, what's the probability that the DNA molecule was accidentally created? And he has a very entertaining way of expressing the probability rather than lots of zeros. If I held out the deck of cards and I asked you to pick the ace of spades on the first try, not getting it wrong once, the odds of your being able to do it would be 1 in 52. Too easy. I'm going to ask you to do it twice in a row without making a mistake in between, with good shuffling and so on. The odds of doing that twice is 1 in 52 times 52, 52 squared. namely 1 in 2,704. Too easy. I want you to do it 5 times in a row without having an error. Now we're up to 52 to the 5th power, and that's over 380 million. We're now into, California lottery kinds of odds. So the question is, what's the odds that DNA developed spontaneously, particularly as quickly as it did? And I've discussed this with Dr. Piccioni. He's talking about anywhere in the universe, not simply on Earth. The odds that DNA was created spontaneously would be the same as pulling the ace of spades from a deck of cards 118,000 times in a row. People will ask me often, evolution versus creationism, Bible and so on. I believe for me, it's pretty clear. Evolution is God's tool for creation. And I think I have a proof text for this. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Na'aseh et hadam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu." Let us make humanity in our image. So the question is, who was God talking to? So the traditional Jewish answer is God was talking to the heavenly host, namely angels and divine beings around when God created. This is the 6th day, God is creating humanity. That's the traditional Jewish answer. Those of you who have some Christian background can guess a traditional Christian answer. God was talking to God's triune self, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. By the way, it's only in Eden that God uses this royal we. Some people will suggest that it's really God speaking in terms of the royal we. But quite often God says, we're going to be talking about this tomorrow night, 10 Commandments. I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. God speaks in the first person singular all the time. The answer I like is God was talking to the animals, or more broadly, God was talking to the rest of creation. God says, okay, creation, now we're going to create humanity from building blocks. And it's going to be in our image. Namely, we're in the image of animals, but we're also created in the divine image. Some of us lean more toward the image of the animal within us, and some of us behave a little better. But that's the proof text that I like. So my bottom line, I'm not going to claim it's a proof, but it more than satisfies me that the evidence is overwhelming that there is an organizing intelligence in the universe. I'm just going to pause. If anybody has a question, would like to, unmute and ask, you can do that, and I will have a drink of water.
Do you want to stop sharing for a second so we can see people? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Maybe as a devil's advocate here. I mean, I've always been looking for a scientific proof for God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
But I just read a paper about the Higgs boson and why a new idea about why its mass is not as large as it was predicted to be. And the paper basically hypothesizes, there's no way to prove this, that at the beginning of the universe, there were actually many, many multi-universes created. And by mathematically analyzing it that way, they're able to actually come out with the Higgs boson mass being less than it is.
Tell us what the Higgs boson mass is, Barry.
Well, the Higgs boson is that particle that was just recently discovered at CERN. They called it the God particle in the popular press.
Do you know why they called it the God particle? When they were talking about it, they called it the goddamn particle.
Right.
And they thought they couldn't actually publish that, so they called it the God particle, getting all the theologians involved.
Very tough.
Because it was so elusive.
Right. Right.
So it's, as you analyze atoms, you have electrons and protons and neutrons, but surprise, surprise, those elementary particles are made up of a bunch of other particles, and they keep looking and looking and looking, and I don't know the details. But go ahead, Jory.
The question I have is, that kind of idea is that I know that for our universe to exist, there are lots and lots of things that have to have the right numbers, that have, you pointed out a lot of them. There's a lot of things that have to be correct. And if you change one physical constant a little bit, the universe doesn't exist. But if there was like an almost infinite number of multiverses
Right.
created and only one of them had the right physical properties, then that's the only one we could exist in.
So for me, the critical words you use was you can't prove it. So the essence of the multiverse, as I understand it, and I'm willing to be corrected, is there are lots and lots of different universes with different physical constants, but they can't be detected. So
Right.
it's as
That
though
some of them may not even exist because they're unstable.
yeah, so they might have existed for milliseconds. So it's as though I say, okay, here's a pen, and I'm going to tell you how gravity really works. There are invisible little springs. And when I let go, those springs contract, but the springs are undetectable by any means known to man. And prove me wrong.
Right.
So for me, the essence of a valid scientific theory is it has to be testable by experiment.
Yeah. No,
Now, there are scientific theories which are very difficult to test. In fact, one example is Einstein predicted gravity waves, but in one of the few predictions which he proved to be wrong was he predicted that gravity waves would never be able to be detected, and they actually were detected. So the essence of a scientific theory, for me to be a kosher, you should pardon the expression, scientific theory, is in connection with the theory, you ought to be able to postulate an experiment which could either confirm the theory or disprove the theory. And if you give me a theory which is inherently untestable, I don't consider that a scientific theory. I consider it, I don't know, poetry.
Right.
It's language, it's not science.
Yeah. By the way, that one of the people who won the Nobel Prize for detecting the gravity waves is in our department right now.
Oh, wow. Yes. And I think it was discovered on Rosh Hashanah, but
yeah, and he's Jewish too.
Yes, of course.
Hey,
Yes. Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's not, I was just trying to say that I'm trying to see what in your argument is testable. I mean, I agree completely.
What is testable is we have a universe.
Yeah.
And the universe is very, 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 very balanced. Okay. That's what's testable. I'm not calling it a proof. I'm asking, first major question is there anything that I find in the universe that's incompatible with God? And that's going to be where I'm going to wind up at the end of the evening. But I'm not proving God, so I don't claim it to be a proof of God. Rabbi.
So, I love all of what you said, it's very interesting, but it seems like you're starting from the end result. Okay, so we have a world with life, and by going backwards, we can say all of these things came together to make life, but it's just as possible that it was random. And there was no design behind it, but this is the particular universe where all of these things happen.
So I object to the use of your phrase "just as possible." It's not just as possible. There's a probability that all of these things create life, and that probability is 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 132nd power. One of the quotes I have in the longer class is a physicist saying, the likelihood of the universe that we find being random is equivalent to a tornado going through a junkyard and producing a fully functioning 747. It's in principle possible, but the question is the probabilities. Any other questions? I want to move on.
Put me down. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Who has questions? Anybody? Any questions? No?
Let me keep going. There's actually a lot of material. Are we back to a good display?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here's some quotes I couldn't resist. Fred Hoyle was an astrophysicist who coined the term the Big Bang. Early in his career, put down religion, saying it's but a desperate attempt to find an escape from the truly dreadful situation in which we find ourselves. No wonder that when many people feel the need for some belief, that gives them a sense of security. No wonder that they become very angry with people like me who say this is illusory, speaking of religion. Later in his career, after work on fine-tuning of the universe, he says a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. So put me and Fred Hoyle in the same side of the opinion. Okay, so we're going to take a deep breath now and move from the question, is there a God, to the question, does God care? So one possibility is there is a God, there is the organizing intelligence in the universe, the laws of physics, if you will, but do the laws of physics care what I have for dinner? Do the laws of physics care that we feed hungry people or that we torture hungry people? Clearly, the laws of physics don't care. The question is, if I call that organizing intelligence in the universe God, does God care? And if God cares, presumably God communicates God's caring. I think it's logically incompatible to say that God cares passionately about us, but is not going to give us any guidance at all. So if God cares, I have to take seriously the question of revelation. I take it very seriously, but I don't take it literally. For Jews, this is the question of what happened at Mount Sinai. So what happened at Mount Sinai, as we know, Moses comes down from the mountain with, in Jewish tradition, both the entire Torah and the oral Torah. So my answer is something happened, but revelation is a human record of what happened. And being a human record, it's an imperfect record. So again, I'm going to move a little quickly. When I ask most people, what are you looking at right now? They will say a box, a cube, or something like that, a parallelogram or a three-dimensional, or, I could ask, but I don't want to take the time. And the answer is projected light and shadow on a screen. This is slides from when I used to actually give this in person rather than on Zoom. Carbon dots on a page. I need to put another bullet in there about lighting up little LEDs on your screens. So there is nothing cubical here. It's dots, okay? What's going on, of course, is that we are perceiving it as a cube because of the shading and the shape. So psychologists tell us that 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and our expectations. We're projecting that this is shade and we're seeing a cube. That element affects what gets written down at Sinai. Now I'm just having some fun. What we see is a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So if I go into longer wavelengths than the electromagnetic spectrum, I get infrared rays, heat rays, radar, TV, shortwave, AM radio, and so on. And actually gravitational waves are huge. And then if I get shorter and shorter, I go to ultraviolet rays, X-rays, gamma rays, and so on. There's a width to the amount of the spectrum that we see. So in the way I calculated it, I said, okay, so what fraction of the entire electromagnetic spectrum can we see? If the whole electromagnetic spectrum were 3,000 miles, what fraction would you guess, expressed as a distance, would you think we see? I'll pause here, see if anybody wants to hazard a guess. What fraction, how many miles, feet, inches, or whatever, would you guess we see in terms of the fraction of the spectrum? Anybody want to take a guess?
1/4 of an inch.
1/4 of an inch. Any other guesses? Cowards. The answer is the ratio of 3,000 miles to the diameter of a hydrogen atom, the smallest atom. We see a very small part. We can detect, we humans, a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum going on around us. On one hand, this is very good. Imagine if you could, with your ears or some other sensory eyes, pick up every radio station that is going on in your room, every cell phone conversation, all the solar wind and static from the universe. But my thesis is something happened at Sinai. A lot of what we wrote down was a function of our cultural expectations, and also the fact that we couldn't tell everything that was going on. We can only, see what we could see and hear what we can hear. A very, I think it's Judith Platt. What's the name of the rabbi, the Jewish feminist rabbi singer?
Judith Plaskow.
Yeah, that's right. She writes that if the text had been written down by women rather than by men, it might have been a very different text. And I don't know if it was she, but people have said, why didn't the women write down the text? Because they were holding the babies. But of course, it was a male-centered world at that time. So I don't take the text of Torah literally. I take it very seriously, but not literally. So I have doubts about God and about the text. So now the next question is that okay? And for me, this is a primary lesson of the story of the generation of the Exodus, which we're actually reading now in our cycle of readings, where we're actually right at Sinai this week in Parshat Yitro, and 10 Commandments. We'll be taking a look at that tomorrow night. So consider that generation, the generation of the Exodus. Let's accept the story as being true for a moment, literal for the moment. They saw some pretty good miracles, right? They saw the 10 plagues. They got to the sea parted. They went through, sea crashed in on their enemies. They are hungry in the desert. They're getting manna from heaven. This is a generation that saw some pretty good miracles, yes? Moses goes up to the mountain, and the understanding is he's one day late coming down. My understanding is there's an ambiguity about whether he said he was going to be back on the 40th day or the 41st day. So Moses' brother, Aaron, the high priest, for crying out loud, supervises the construction of a golden calf and says, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. So if that generation that saw all those miracles happened to them personally, could lose faith on something as simple as a timing issue, how much more likely is it that we who have not seen such terrific miracles would lose faith, or at least have doubts? I also appeal to something that I call the police car example. So imagine you're cruising on one of the California freeways, at the new regulation speed of 72.5 miles an hour. And all of a sudden you see up in front of you a highway patrol car that's going at 65 miles an hour. Do you zip by and wave hello, or do you slow down? You and I have all seen this long line of cars behind the highway patrol car and nobody in front of the highway patrol car. Why? Because we have a high expectation that if we speed past the highway patrol car, we are going to get a ticket. I submit to you that having doubt is necessary for free will. If I'll speak for myself, if I had perfect certainty about God and God's existence and the punishment for sin and the reward for mitzvot, it would be like driving down the freeway with the highway patrol car in my rear view mirror, or more intense than that, the highway patrol officer in the passenger seat with his ticket book, or even more than that, my father teaching me how to drive in terms of not breaking any rules. But I don't have perfect confidence, so therefore I am really free to either obey or disobey. So I submit to you that having some doubt is necessary for free will. And of course, the literal translation of the word Yisrael, the word Israel, means one who wrestles with God. So if we were perfectly accepting of God's ultimate power and wisdom and everything else, we wouldn't be wrestling with God. We would be submitting to God. And the word Islam means submission. Judaism and Islam are actually quite close to each other theologically, but in this way, we are very different. Israel, we struggle with God. Islam, we submit to God. So I take Torah seriously, but not literally. Torah, Bible, Midrash, Talmud is our central myth. I believe it is true, but I believe it is true in the same way that I believe the boy who cried wolf is true. If I asked you that, most people in our culture are familiar with the story of the boy who cried wolf. If I asked you, did it really happen? Is it an actual historical record of some incident? We might have an interesting discussion on it. If I asked you, does it matter? Suppose I could prove to you that that story was made up by someone. Would that affect the truth that that story is teaching? And the answer is, of course, no. Torah is true, Bible is true in the lessons that it teaches us. It is not true in terms of the science and the physics that it purports to include. It is more truthful in a way than a historical record. I often comment, I have physics textbooks, and they typically are out of date within 5, 10, 15 years of their publication. We are reading a Torah that's certainly in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And we study it just as carefully today as we studied it 2,000 years ago because of the truths there are contained. So I want to move on to a significant problem for those of us in the religion biz, or those of us who take God seriously. And that problem is the problem of theodicy. Theodicy is a branch of theology which addresses the question of evil and tragedy. And I divide these two into two separate questions. For me, the issue of evil, while very serious, is not a huge theological problem for me. Evil is a consequence of us having free will. God gives us the ability to make gas chambers and torture chambers and hospitals and, and orphanages and places to care for people, and God doesn't force our hands. If some, I'll use this image later, if some idiot shoots a bullet up in the air, the path of that bullet is guided by my old career as a physicist, not my new career as a rabbi. The bullet is not going to seek out a righteous person and protect that person and land on a rotten person. The laws of physics are just going to govern. So that's evil. Tragedy is a bigger problem. Tragedy is what insurance companies like to call acts of God. You can talk about cancer, you can talk about tsunamis, you can talk about earthquakes. That's tragedy. It's something horrible that happens, but I can't attribute it to human free will. So there is a wonderful treatment of this issue, really presented very well in the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner, and summarized for me quite elegantly. I don't know if Ed Feinstein ever wrote it up like this, in this way. So just to give you a hint of what happened to Rabbi Kushner, young conservative rabbi, newly married, they have their first child, Aaron, and very quickly they find out that Aaron has a disease called progeria. Progeria is rapid aging, and Aaron dies at age 14, not having lived the most pleasant of lives. So Rabbi Kushner is asking the question, how is it possible that God would allow this to happen? How is it possible? What did Aaron do that would have merited this? So he is struggling with this, and so we have the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Martha, you have your hand raised. If you're there, you need to unmute. And we'll see if Martha finds the unmute button, or maybe she just hit the wrong button. Anyway, let me go on. So in this formulation, I would say, according to the rules of logic, I'm not yet into theology. According to the rules of logic, at least one of the following three statements must be false. Statement number one, God is all good and all just. Statement number two, God is all powerful. Statement number three, bad things happen to good people. If God is truly all good and all just and all powerful, bad things can't happen to good people definitionally. So the question is, according to your own view of theology, which one of these are false? By the way, you might say they're all false. You might say there is no God. By the way, if there is no God, you have nothing to complain about when bad things happen. It's all random crap, pardon the expression, in the world. There's no meaning to it. There's no justice to it. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just random. So I want to look at each of these statements separately. So the first one, God is all good and all just. So this is the God I described in Leap. Assume that that's false. If that is false, that's the God of the Greek philosophers. That's the God of as laws of physics. You know, the God that set all these physical constants in place doesn't care about goodness and justice. And by the way, Kushner's book is a commentary on the book of Job. This actually is Job's conclusion. People always talk about the patience of Job. It lasts for 2 brief chapters in a book of well over 40 chapters. Job is not particularly patient. He absolutely acknowledges God's power. He knows that a bad thing has happened to a good person, and by the way, so do we, because we can read the book and listen to the voice of the narrator. But he absolutely denies that God is all good and all just. I'm going to jump to number 3. Suppose the statement bad things happen to good people is false. That can be false in 2 possible ways. One way is maybe the thing isn't really bad. So, you know, bad things might happen in your life, and I hear this all the time. I suspect, Rabbi Singer, you do too. People have gone through terrible experiences, and at the end of the experience, while they wouldn't recommend it to anyone, they've come out wiser, deeper, more compassionate, and so on. So they might say the thing isn't really bad. On a more mundane basis, you know, before vaccines became a politically charged topic, a baby is getting a vaccine. You know, DPT, whatever inoculations a newborn baby gets. From the baby's worldview, a perfectly good baby all of a sudden has a pain in its tush. And why? A bad thing happened to a good baby. From our point of view, we realize the thing isn't bad at all. It's really a miracle. So maybe the bad thing that's happened is not really bad. That's one possibility. The other possibility is maybe no one is really good. And I would say, you know, to a large degree, Christianity is based on the idea of original sin. And so we are all sinners. So therefore, if bad things happen to us, it's not a question of God's injustice. It's the fact that we are inherently sinners. Go back to the Garden of Eden, a subject for a different discussion. Obviously, as a Jew, I don't hold with that theology at all. But I also have to point out that there are Jewish theologies, which particularly Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, which hold with the idea that that we are reincarnated, that we live different lives, and maybe we sinned in a prior life. So the apparent horrible things happening to a apparently good person in this incarnation, we are really paying for sins in a prior incarnation. Or another theology, which you will also hear from Jewish sources, is it's the price we're paying for a wonderful life in the afterlife. So those are all possibilities. I actually reject them. And so I'm going to jump to where Rabbi Kushner winds up and also to where I wind up. The statement, God is all powerful, Rabbi Kushner and I would argue is false. There's a wonderful story in the Talmud. You may have heard this. The story goes like this. It turns out that there are 2 commandments for which, if you comply with these commandments, you are promised a long life. The first one we'll read tomorrow night. If we read it in detail, it says, honor your father and your mother that you may long endure in the land that I am giving you. So God promises us a good life if we honor our parents. The second commandment is more obscure. It says, when you take a baby bird or an egg from a nest, you should shoo away the mother bird. And you hear that same language, that you will long endure in the land that I'm giving you. So those are the only 2 commandments. So the story in the Talmud goes like this. A father asks his son, son, take that ladder, climb that tree, and bring me down. I can't remember if it's eggs or nestlings. Let's say eggs. Bring me down some eggs from that, from the nest up there. The son complies with his father, takes the ladder. So he's fulfilling the first commandment. He's honoring his father. He climbs the ladder. Before he takes the eggs, he shoos away the mother bird. He complies with the second commandment. And then on the way down, the ladder breaks and he falls to his death. So now the rabbis of the Talmud are going to try and make sense of this. How is this possible? And they go through a very interesting discussion. I think one says, we don't believe the story. And another one says, no, we heard this from Rabbi so-and-so, and we always believe his stories. And then another one says, I know, the boy was thinking evil thoughts. And I think the response is the Aramaic equivalent of, give me a break. He's complying with the commandments. And of course, in Judaism, we're not punished for thought crimes. We're rewarded and punished for what we do. And they argue and argue and argue, and they come up with a brilliant, deep theological insight. The brilliant, deep theological insight is that the ladder was defective. The ladder broke and he fell to his death. And the insight is the world operates according to its own rules. You guys are all wonderful, righteous people. Mazel tov and God bless you. You still have to take your meds. You still have to put on your seatbelts. You still have to live and protect yourselves from the dangers of the world. There are other parts of the Talmud which says that nature operates under its own laws. The arguments go like this. They say, din hu, it would be justice if somebody stole seeds, person A steals a sack of seeds from person B and plants them, it would be just if those seeds never sprouted, but we know they sprout. They even say it would be just if adultery wouldn't produce children, but we know adultery does produce children, and that leads to all kinds of horrible problems in the traditional Jewish world. But in the Talmud, they conclude that nature operates according to its own laws and its own path, and God either cannot or will not. There's a very interesting argument we can have for hours about whether God is incapable of interfering with the laws of nature once set up. Remember we talked about leap number one, God set up these laws, or God can violate them but doesn't. This is the answer that makes most sense to Rabbi Kushner and makes most sense to me. I once heard him being interviewed, and someone asked him the question. This is Harold Kushner. He was asked the question. He said, isn't it possible that God does things that you don't understand? And I love his response. He said, my plumber does things that I don't understand. But there's nothing about my son's suffering that I don't understand. So then the question is, who needs God? And unsurprisingly, Rabbi Kushner has written a book called Who Needs God? By the way, Rabbi Kushner's written about a dozen wonderful books, and I recommend them all to you. And if you find you bought the wrong book and it's Rabbi Larry Kushner rather than Rabbi Harold Kushner, that's wonderful too. It's mysticism rather than this work. But in the question then, what good is God? Who needs God if God is not all powerful? God's role, Rabbi Kushner would argue, and I would argue, is as a teacher, an inspirer, a commander, a friend, and a companion. So here's the analogy I love to draw. And it's, by the way, of course, it's not new. The imaging God as a parent is not a new idea that I came up with. But I want to look at that image, that metaphor, a little deeper. In our infancy, our parents work miracles for us. Baby is crawling towards something dangerous, or the fireplace or a step or something. All of a sudden, the baby is flying. How is the baby flying? Mom or dad is picking up the baby, putting the baby into the crib. Baby is wet, dirty diaper. Diaper is magically changed. Baby's worldview, baby has no idea how this is happening. Baby's just lying back and watching these birds that are making beautiful music and just going on. And the baby is powdered with pleasant smelling powder. And then there's a warm bottle, or even better, a warm breast magically appearing out of nowhere, manna from heaven. From the baby's worldview, the parents are working absolute miracles. The toddler's world now gets a little more complicated. Toddler's playing in the front yard, and mom or dad says, don't play in the street. If you play in the street, you're going to get hit by a car. Mom or dad doesn't say, if you go in the street, there's a 10% chance a car may come along and a 5% chance the car might not see you, leading to a 0.5% chance you'll get hit by a car. No, it's quite simple. If you play in the street, you're going to get hit by a car. And if the car doesn't hit you, I will. Okay, very simple, black and white. Child gets a little bit older. I always talk about an actual conversation I had with my son, Howie, who is an actor, teaches acting. And when he was 16 years old, he just got his driver's license and he was very involved in acting and he was pretty good. So he was invited to join an acting company in Hollywood. Now, Rabbi Singer knows where I live. It's with no traffic, it's 45 minutes to Hollywood from, Westlake Village, Thousand Oaks area. So here's my son with his brand new license in high school asking me, is it okay if he joins this acting company so they can rehearse on weekday evenings? And of course, they're rehearsing late because none of these people have jobs in acting. They are all waiters and busboys and have real jobs. So they're working late. And of course, I say no. And I explain the reasons. Now, do you think my son's response was, thank you, Father. I so appreciate your deeper understanding of the complexities and the hazards associated not only with my physical safety, but my development as a high school student and the likelihood of getting into college and the need for a night's sleep. Do you think that's what my son said to me? No. The ultimate deciding factor in this argument was because I'm your father, that's why. Now my children are chronologically adults and I can't work miracles for them. Sometimes I write a check and it seems like a miracle to them, but those of us who have adult children know that we really can't change the things that we would love to be able to miraculously change in our children's lives. So I submit to you that this is analogous to our relationship with God. When I think about the stories in the Torah, the stories in the Bible, there are miracles. And to me, this is our memory of our spiritual infancy. In our spiritual infancy, our recollection is that God worked miracles. We get a little bit older as a people, and the if-then things, if you play in the street, you're going to get hit by a car, strikes me as the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is a long list of good things that will happen to you if you obey God's laws, and horrible things that will happen to you if you disobey God's laws. In fact, I didn't realize this, but the longest chapter, I think in the Bible, certainly in the Torah, is a list of curses that will happen if you disobey God's laws, and they are horrible. I mean, it's horrible even to say, but if you disobey God's laws, things will be so bad for you, God says in the Torah, that you and your spouse will fight over eating the flesh of your child. That's how bad things are going to get. Clearly, it's not true. And the book of Job, and I don't have time to get into detail about the book of Job, but the book of Job is one long counter argument to the book of Deuteronomy, because Job has horrible things happening to him and he hasn't committed these sins, and we know that. So the question is why? Well, it turns out in the book of Job, Job summons God as judge, jury, and defendant in the trial of Job versus God, and demands that God show up. And lo and behold, God does show up. And God gives this elegant series of speeches which really reduce to the point, I'm God, you're not, because I'm your father, that's why. Basically, God says, where were you when I created the universe? Created the Higgs boson. I don't think that that's a literal translation of the book of Job. Goes on and on and on. And at the end, and here is the critical point in the book for me, God says, basically, you can't possibly understand my ways, just like my son couldn't possibly understand why I was telling him he couldn't drive at night when he was 16, late at night. God says your friends are wrong. Job has friends that come up and basically preach Deuteronomy to him. You must have sinned. You're suffering. It's because you've sinned. Repent, reject your sin. God will forgive you. Job says, no, I know I haven't sinned. And God says your friends are wrong. So the problem is more complex. And then these days, I submit to you that our relationship with God as a humanity, as a Jewish people, is like the relationship between an adult child and an adult parent. We can't work miracles for each other, but there is value in the relationship. There is value in the shared wisdom. There is value in the love, in the caring, in the understanding, and just in the communication.
Michael, I just want to mention that in March and April, I am going to be teaching a multi-part series on the Book of Job. So if people are interested in that question, we will dig into it further.
And are you aware, Rabbi, that Harold Kushner has written a second book called When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person?
Oh, no, I didn't know about the second.
Oh, you
book.
will love it. It is a
Okay.
detailed, line by line almost,
Okay, that's great.
commentary on Job. And I just happen to have a PowerPoint presentation on this.
Okay. All right. I just want to mention, I think we're going to need to wrap up in about 7 minutes.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so I will try and move on. Religious wars. We often hear the idea that religious wars have claimed more lives and so on and so on. It's not even close. There is a very interesting book. I won't go into all the numbers. These slides are on my website. I don't recommend this book as a birthday gift. It's called The Great Big Book of Horrible Things. It is a list of human atrocities that result in mass murder, and religion accounts for a relatively small fraction of the total. So in summarizing where we are, I would say in deciding to live a religious life, I make 2 leaps of faith. One, that God, the organizing intelligence in the universe, exists. This one is easy for me, since for me the science is compelling. The second one is that God cares. For me, this is a pure leap of faith. So my bottom lines is I would go further than Einstein. Einstein said science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. I would argue that it goes deeper, that religion needs science. If the purpose of religion, and certainly it's the purpose of Judaism, is to make the world a better place, we ought to understand how the world works. If I'm sick, pray for me, knock your socks off, but help me get to a doctor, because I believe God's given us through science the wisdom of how to treat those diseases. I would also argue that science needs religion. If the purpose of religion is to improve and expand human knowledge, we're going to need humans around. And I would argue that without religious ethics, our scientific knowledge has a history of leading to mass murder and destruction. And the thing keeping us from oblivion may well be the extent to which we adopt religious ethics. So my bottom line is there is nothing irrational about belief in God and in the belief that God cares. If we live as though God exists and cares, our lives are better and the world is better. This is an important one, which I don't have time to dwell on, but my buying into this world has made me a happier person. And I'm pretty sure I've helped other people, Jewish and not Jewish. I believe that buying into the religious system makes the world a better place. There's a midrash explaining a puzzling comment of God. God is quoted in Isaiah as saying, "You are my people and I am God. You are my witnesses, and I am God." And so the rabbis of the midrash say what God was really saying is, if we are not God's witnesses, then God might as well not be God. So it's our job to bring God into the world. And if we are to survive and thrive, we better study both science and religion. And Dayenu, that's enough for me. So I'm going to skip the discussion of the blind people examining the elephant to see if there's any last questions that you have before we need to go.
Yeah, we have
I
time
have
for
one
like
quick
1 or 2
question.
questions.
I
Ezra,
have
go
one
ahead.
quick question. I realize it's not an immediate problem, but where does the sun eventually burning out figure in all this?
If the science is correct, and I have no doubt that it is correct, if we are able to survive up until that point, then presumably we will work out the science of getting to a safe place. Carl Sagan was obsessed with the question of finding life on other planets, because what he said was that if we find life on other planets, what that means is life can develop to the point where you can communicate by radio waves without destroying yourself. So that ultimately is the question, are we going to be able to progress scientifically to the point where we can address these kinds of problems before we wipe ourselves out in a nuclear holocaust? And we don't know the answer to that question.
One more question from somebody, any more? Or Ezra, do you have a follow-up?
Well, apparently there is a theory whose name I have forgotten, is one of the reasons we haven't found life on other planets is that once a species gets smart enough to destroy itself, it does.
Yes, and that's a real possibility. And that was one of the reasons that Sagan was so obsessed with the search for life on other planets. If we do find life on other planets, that would be a very hopeful sign. And again, there's a theologian, Yitz Greenberg, who asks the awesome and awful question of, if God was trying to teach us something in the Holocaust, if we look at the Holocaust as revelation, what might that be? What lesson can we learn from the Holocaust? And there are clearly many, but one is, no matter how horrible we act towards each other, God will not intervene to save our butts. There can be no more eloquent proof of that thesis than more than 1 million murdered innocent children without God presumably interfering. You know, God could have caused Mrs. Hitler to have a miscarriage. The God that created the universe could have prevented the birth of Hitler and Eichmann and other assorted Nazis, but that didn't happen. So, so the message is, we are responsible and we are on our own.
Well, with that cheerful note, I want to thank Rabbi Lotker for a very enlightening, very informative session, and very provocative also. I'm sure we have lots of other questions, which we can perhaps pepper him with after services tomorrow evening. So tomorrow evening, Rabbi Lotker is going to lead most of the service and is going to give a sermon, and he's going to focus on anti-Semitism, which is a different topic than the one we had.
Actually, I just sent you an email. I'm going to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, but my focus is actually back on ethics.
Oh,
yeah. Sorry about
okay.
that.
Well,
sorry about that. Yeah.
Minute by minute news
Yes.
flashes. Okay, we had talked about. We do want to, address to some extent what happened in Texas, and both of us will address it in one form or another. But I guess now we're going to go back to medical and legal.
Yeah, and I will point out, tomorrow I actually taught a 6-session class on anti-Semitism, and all the videos are on my website.
We'll send people to your videos. I also want to thank the Legacy Fund for making it possible to bring Rabbi Lotker to our Zoom reality. Unfortunately, we're both disappointed that he wasn't able to come in person, but next time.
Yes, I'm bummed that I'm not there to spend time with you all in person. But next year in Riverside, doesn't that
hopefully.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening, and thank you all for joining us. And this is recorded, so if anybody missed it or missed part of it, or if anybody is interested in letting their friends know that this was a great lecture, let them know, and it'll be up on YouTube tomorrow. So good night, everybody.
No,
Night.
thank you,
Bye.
Rabbi.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.